Hey y'all! It's entry number 87 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Keenan Allen, wide receiver, Los Angeles Chargers. We'll start with the positives with Keenan Allen's fantasy profile. Consistency. Keenan Allen has been fairly consistent the past few seasons, catching at least 97 passes in each of the last 5 seasons and having at least 992 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns in each of the past 5 seasons, with 4 of the last 5 seasons with 1,130 receiving yards or more according to Pro Football Reference. On a week-to-week basis, he was also very consistent last year from a fantasy perspective. In half PPR formats, Keenan Allen had 4 out of 16 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 6 out of 16 games with 10 to 14.9 fantasy points, and 6 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points according to fantasy data. This consistency can be pretty valuable from a fantasy perspective because you know what you're going to get from Allen, and it makes him a set and forget option in most lineups. The next thing I really like about Keenan Allen's fantasy profile is the fact that he's got an elite quarterback. Keenan Allen has one of the best quarterbacks in the league throwing him the ball in Justin Herbert. As a rookie in 2020, Justin Herbert had the most passing touchdowns with 31 and completions with 396 by a rookie quarterback ever, and had the best interceptable pass rate in the NFL during his rookie year, only having 15 interceptable passes, one for every 39.7 passing attempts according to QB Datamine. Herbert followed this up with an even better season in 2021, where he completed 443 passes on 672 passing attempts for 5,014 passing yards and 38 passing touchdowns to just 15 interceptions. Having a great quarterback should make it easier for Keenan Allen to put up solid fantasy numbers each week. The last major thing I really like about Keenan Allen's fantasy profile is the fact that he's a target hog. Keenan Allen saw the 8th most targets in the NFL last year with 157 according to Pro Football Reference. Allen has seen an average of 9.22 targets per game over the course of his career, or a 17-game pace of 157 targets, and gotten at least 136 targets in each of the last 5 seasons according to Pro Football Reference. Seeing this kind of workload makes it easier to trust Keenan Allen in your fantasy leagues. Moving on to some of the concerns with Keenan Allen's fantasy profile: per route, per target, and per pass attempt numbers. Keenan Allen frequently gets open, and he's arguably the best route runner in the league, which is why he sees so many targets. But if you are looking purely at his per route, per target, and per passing attempt numbers, they aren't particularly impressive. During the 2021 season, Keenan Allen averaged 1.93 yards per route run, the 35th best among wide receivers, 7.2 yards per target, the 68th best among wide receivers, 10.7 yards per reception, the 79th best among wide receivers, 1.69 yards per team passing attempt, the 22nd best among wide receivers, 0.44 fantasy points per route run, the 35th best among wide receivers, and 1.64 fantasy points per target, the 60th best among wide receivers according to Player Profiler. The next concern I have with Keenan Allen's fantasy profile is the fact that Mike Williams is ascending. Mike Williams had a career year last season where he put up 76 receptions on 129 targets for 1,146 receiving yards and 9 receiving touchdowns according to Pro Football Reference. He was especially on fire the first few weeks of the NFL season before he suffered a knee injury in Week 5 that bothered him the rest of the season. Given Mike Williams is the X-receiver in Los Angeles, which is frequently utilized in Joe Lombardi's style of offense, there's a chance that Mike Williams clearly makes the jump over Keenan Allen and becomes the Chargers' top weapon. The last major concern I have with Keenan Allen's fantasy profile for 2022 is the fact that he's getting older. Keenan Allen is 30 years old going into the 2022 season. While this isn't quite the age where most wide receivers decline, now that he's on the wrong side of 30, it's a discussion that will at least be popping up on the radar now. Some additional thoughts on Keenan Allen's fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, Keenan Allen finished as the WR15 in Standard with 151.8 total fantasy points and 9.5 fantasy points per game. The WR14 in half PPR formats with 204.8 total fantasy points and 12.8 fantasy points per game. And the WR11 in full PPR formats with 257.8 total fantasy points and 16.1 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. Injury history. Keenan Allen has a pretty extensive injury history. While he hasn't dealt with anything major since his ACL tear in 2016, he's had a ton of minor injuries, ankle sprains, knee sprains, back spasms, hamstring strains, etc. since then. Route wins. Keenan Allen had the most total route wins among wide receivers in 2021 with 270 according to Player Profiler. Air yards. Keenan Allen averaged 83.7 air yards per game, 1.47 air yards per snap, and had 27.3% of his team's air yards in 2021 according to RotoWire. All of these numbers were above average. Personal opinion. Keenan Allen is currently going off the board as WR9, about pick 26 overall, on ESPN, and WR11, about pick 31 overall on Yahoo. He's a guy that is generally slightly overvalued in standard leagues and appropriately valued in PPR formats. With Keenan Allen, you sort of know what you're going to get. A high-end WR2 type of finish, and a possibility for a mid to low-end WR1 type of finish in full PPR formats, with solid weekly production, but not many big games. He had 0 games with over 20 fantasy points in half PPR formats for the 2021 season. At his ESPN ADP, there are a few players that I would generally prefer going after him, like Saquon Barkley or Nick Chubb. But he's a relatively safe wide receiver target in the 3rd to 4th round of most leagues. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Keenan Allen did a pledge it to support at-risk youth in San Diego in the past, so here's a link to the Boys and Girls Club of Greater San Diego. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.